Welcome to the Rob Call Bottom Up Show, sponsored by opednews.com, available on Pacifica Radio Network and iTunes and Stitcher and Progressive Radio Network. This show is called the Bottom Up Show because I think we're transitioning from a top-down to a bottom-up culture, and it's happening fast, and it's happening because I think that we have it in our genes. For millions of years, we evolved to be bottom-up. And that's why I wrote a book about it, The Bottom Up Revolution. And it's coming out next month in May. And I'm excited about that. And so I try to get an angle on that, even though many times I have guests on who are not directly related to that. And my guest for this show are Mitchel Cohen and Robin Falk Esser. And we're talking about a book, The Fight Against Monsanto's Roundup, The Politics of Pesticides. And this is a valuable, important, powerful book at a time where it's really needed. And I love the way that it gets into specifics. Mitchel Cohen coordinates the No Spray Coalition in New York City, which successfully sued the city government over its indiscriminate spraying of toxic pesticides. In 1997, Mitch organized the campaign to rid New York City public schools of milk from cows injected with genetically engineered bovine growth hormone. And in 2001, he ran for mayor of New York City as one of the 5 Green Party candidates. He was editor of the national newspaper Green Politics and of the New York State Green Party newspaper. Robin Esser has a PhD in physiology and biofeedback and Robin Esser has a PhD in physiology and biophysics and has published papers in Science and Nature and co-authored scientific papers published in the Journal of Physiology, the Journal of General Physiology, and the Biophysical Journal. And she's been a lifelong political activist. Thanks so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it.
Hey, Rob, and greetings to your audience.
Hi.
Hi. So I want to start off talking about the fight, and then later in the show, we'll have you, Robin, talk about the actual effects of glyphosate and Roundup, which I learned from reading this book. They're not exactly the same. Roundup is worse than pure glyphosate, but we'll get into that in the second half of the show. So, Mitch, in your preface to the book, you ask, will activists succeed in forcing their countries to reverse course? And then you say, we need to be reborn as ecology activists striving to win society to a different way of looking at human interactions with nature and to take action based on that transformed consciousness. So that really interests me because I've always been interested in the hero's journey, which is about waking up and becoming a new person and going on a journey. So what do you mean be reborn as ecology activists, striving to win society to a different way of looking at human interactions with nature? That sounds to me a lot like what I'm talking about when I talk about with bottom-up connection consciousness, making people more aware of their relationship with nature.
Well, I agree, Rob. But it's more than making people aware. People make themselves aware, and we need to challenge, what do we mean by a weed? Why do we kill a weed and see things as weeds? Why do we accept the dominant paradigm about what we need to eliminate, how we see ourselves, how we see nature around us? What do we mean by a pest? Why is something a pest? I mean, weeds are, in many American Indian societies and in other societies, were treatments for different ailments that people had, and yet here we're killing them. Even dandelions, I mean, just the simple thing of dandelions on a lawn, we have to have that pristine green, short-cropped lawn rather than beautiful dandelions growing, other flowers growing. They're seen as weeds. You got to knock them out. I remember.
You made me think of something there, because really, I'm going to throw back in more about bottom-up, but bottom-up is a way of looking at things that involve systems and patterns and relationships, whereas top-down tends to be more linear and straight-edged. And what you just described is really, these lawns that have to be so perfectly manicured. This is the obsession with neatness, and whereas nature is all about diversity and randomness and a little bit of chaos thrown in. So even just looking at your lawn, a kind of a consciousness that would be pro-nature would not be a straight-edged, neat lawn. That would be anti-nature, really. So maybe that's a good place to start in terms with people looking at their relationship with nature.
Well, I agree. It's the idea of having a lawn to begin with. People didn't used to have lawns. That became at a certain point in history. We talk a bit about that in the book, where it was an idea pushed on people about what is the good life? What do we mean by progress? How do we go forward? And we need to challenge all that in ourselves, ask ourselves, where do these ideas come from, and not just accept them as given and that we adopt and that we then put back out there. So now people build lawns using Scott Turf Builder or other chemical companies. Glyphosate is one, Roundup, Monsanto's Roundup. We're poisoning ourselves. We're poisoning by this idea that the way of moving forward is through destroying pretty much everything around us. And then the same in terms of life forms, in terms of patterns that we fall into.
And when you get into the patterns, you're getting into this. I think we're talking about falling back to being a part of a consumer culture, a culture that is designed to divorce us and separate us from each other, from our communities, from nature itself. And I think that just these ideas, I hadn't thought about it, but this conversation is making me think about it, that Monsanto's glyphosate and Roundup is really a symptom of people being sold that they need to have a certain kind of lawn, a certain kind of garden, a certain kind of appearance to present to the world. And so really, Roundup, at least when it's used on lawns, is all about people wanting to look a certain way for other people. Or a lot of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But it's not only that people on their lawns and their houses, it's also massive, huge corporations, not only individual people in our gardens, but these huge corporations that are massively monocropping huge tracts of the Earth's surface to create the single crop and destroying the diversity of nature in order to be able to then use the sprays that they use en masse and blanket whole huge areas. So it's all genetically engineered. The crops that that the glyphosate and Roundup have to do with is intimately tied to genetic engineering. So they manufacture genetically engineered Roundup ready corn, Roundup ready soy, Roundup ready cotton in these huge tracts of land. It's all monocrop, and then they spray it with Roundup pesticide. So the pesticide is designed to be able to saturate the plants, kill all other life forms except the plant, which now can withstand the spray that's being put on it. So it's not just our gardens, although that's part of it. That's how we are driven to accepting it. But it's not only that. It has
I
to
think
do
that
with
the garden is a metaphor. Really, more the important part is what you're talking about with food. And the other thing is, Roundup, or at least glyphosate, is not just used on GMO plants. It's used on most wheat and oats as well, as you mentioned in the book.
Yeah, it's a drying agent. Quaker Oats uses Roundup on it. Why? This is absurd. To dry out, a desiccant to dry out the crop that they're doing. Why can't they dry it if they need to in other ways? Because it makes it convenient for the owners, for the corporation, not for the people involved, where health becomes secondary or third or fourth or not considered at all. And
I think what people need to be aware of, is that it's not just about GMO, that if you have wheat or oats that is not organic, you're probably eating glyphosate. And
Absolutely.
that. And Robin Falk Esser will talk about that later in the show, about the actual physical effects on animals and cells and life.
That's right. So
Well, I just wanted to say one thing about your concept of bottom up versus top down, that agribusiness is really imposing the type of agriculture that goes on in the global south. That's top down. They're taking away the right of the farmer, the local economy in the global south, to function bottom up, which would be, of course, the way we want the world to be. And they're taking away that choice by imposing genetically modified seeds on the global south. And they have to buy those seeds because the pesticide is made to not affect those seeds.
Right.
So that fits in really beautifully with your concept of the world going towards a bottom up versus top down.
And so we have to fight it. We have to fight. I mean, I've felt for many years that Monsanto, and now that Bayer has acquired them, Bayer is one of the most evil corporations in the world because of what they are doing, destroying. They're attempting to destroy seed and food diversity, really, with their approach.
it's not our friendly aspirin company. It was made. It worked with IG Farben and with the Nazis in World War II. And all the pesticides that are being used today came out of the development of nerve gases that were used by the Nazis and the British also in World War II and even before that. So this is not a nicety nice, simple approach by our corporates who are trying to help us and advance progress. What they're trying to do is dominate the Earth's surface to make money and to control what's produced on there and to control how it's produced.
And what I learned in the book is that Monsanto, now as part of Bayer itself, has become the most powerful agribusiness entity on the planet, owning and controlling 25% of the world's seeds. And going along with what you said about the roots of Monsanto being nerve gas used during World War I, you had a real coup in getting Vandana Shiva, a rock star activist in my mind, to do the forward to your book. And she talks about how this is a war against nature, what they're doing. They literally, Monsanto and Bayer, they think about their approach to farming not as a peaceful synergistic relationship with nature. They think of it as a war on nature, stealing the sun, killing the enemy, rather than working the way that humans did for so many millions of years in a peaceful, healthy, natural interaction. And that works, because I know that there is research that shows that this monoculture farming is not as effective. It may be more profitable, but it's not the best way to use the land.
Yeah, to say the least. Getting back to Vandana Shiva, who's also a hero of mine as well, she'll be touring next week, depending on when this is going to air. But she'll be in the third week or fourth week in April. She'll be touring throughout Vermont and New England. And we'll be going and meeting with her and hoping to tour with her, with Brian Tokar, with others throughout the area. But Vandana Shiva calls it the poison cartel. That's what we are facing now, with Bayer owning Monsanto, with Dow and DuPont's agricultural sections merging into a thing called Corteva, controls the other 25% of the world's seeds. Then we have ChemChina joining with Syngenta. And these are all huge multi-billion dollar mergers and purchases. And between the three of them, they control a good, maybe 80% of the world's seeds, which means that there won't be any seeds soon to plant that are not genetically engineered. And that's going to be, farmers are going to be desperate. They're already desperate in India, there are these huge suicides, over 10,000 suicides by local farmers because they can't afford to, and they're not allowed to regrow the seeds from genetically engineered crops that are grown what farmers have always done. You always replant the seeds every year. But now they're not allowed to do that. And some of the plants don't even generate seeds that are genetically engineered. So this is
and they've been killing themselves by actually drinking glyphosate.
So, yeah, that's a poetic attempt to make a political statement by killing themselves. And it's thousands of people. And this is horrible. At the same time, we have only 7 countries in the world that have thus far, as of the writing of the book, that have banned the production of genetically engineered crops, the planting of and the production of it. Dr. Martha Herbert makes the interesting, very interesting point in the book, the difference between cultivation of seeds and production in a mass market, mass industrialized agribusiness. And of those 7 countries, one of them is Venezuela that has banned, who would have thought that had banned. Another country that does is Russia. It's amazing to me that Russia has banned the planting of genetically engineered seeds. And Putin and the Duma, I was floored when I read all this because I didn't expect it at all. And they banned Monsanto directly, not only the seeds. And there's a part in the book which we quote from the representative of Monsanto, the vice president in Europe, who said, "Oh, this is no problem. In a few years, they'll go away. Everybody will be dead who did this, and we'll just move back in again. And we'll be able to get into Russia."
I have a theory about that. I have a theory that when you have a company as evil and deceptive and death-dealing as Monsanto and Bayer, that the answer is you have to execute the company. I just came up with this very recently. There should be a death penalty for corporations, and the thing that should be, and I think they should probably do the same thing with Facebook too. I think that the thing that they should do is execute the company and then make all of the patents and intellectual property rights common, a part of the commons, open to everyone.
Absolutely. You take out the profit for the private companies and put it at the science, at the disposal for the benefit of humankind and animals and nature, and you have a whole different set of decisions that would be made.
Yeah.
That won't even look anywhere near the same as today, because today is driven by profit.
Yeah.
Driven by corporate control and domination.
One way to try to get at the company and execute them is to use the law against them. Use lawfare, which is sort of what they use against their opponents. They use the law in a way against justice.
Now, when you say lawfare, you're comparing it to warfare. Is that why you use that term?
Right. That's right. That's what. Yeah. And there are now 11,000 cases against Monsanto.
Wow.
Of people who got non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. There's a very great likelihood that they got it from exposure to Roundup. And you probably are aware that 2 of the cases have been already decided in favor of the litigant against Monsanto for hundreds of thousands of dollars.
Millions,
and
hundreds of millions.
Yeah.
Billion.
Yeah.
A $250 million that Wayne Johnson got.
Well,
Like
apparently the judge
award.
already struck down two-thirds of it, so it's down to about $90 million now. But that's still wonderful. And in your book, your book just came out, and in the book when you wrote it, it was 5,000 lawsuits.
Right.
Now it's up to 11,000. That's wonderful.
Right, there are all these lawyers who are advertising on TV now. Have you been poisoned by Roundup? Come to us. We'll sue. And this is quite amazing. Monsanto and Bayer.
Let's take a step back, Mitchell, because one of the things I wanted to do is you've got an awful lot of great detail in this book, but I wanted to get a really big picture of where you are with all of this. So give me your biggest picture of how you think about this and what the problem is and what we need to do.
Well, that's quite a question. Nobody else has asked that.
I try to do that, yeah.
That's right. Well, it's not only about agriculture. It's about corporate domination and control. And as you put it, and a return to the commons, and to make commons a verb, not only a noun. So make things so we're commoning, we're taking back that which is stolen from us.
It's the opposite of privatization.
Absolutely. And private patenting. Why are things privately patented? For money. Why is that? Why do we think progress entails creating these giant facilities that are killing us? Nuclear power plants, for instance, or so our friendly atom, if you remember back in the late 50s and early 60s, which I barely remember, but so they were sold to us. Warfare, the type of nuclear wars that we're facing now, with all the nuclear weapons and with the U.S. government now pulling out of the nuclear weapons treaties. So all of this has to do with a way of thinking about the world that most people in the world, I believe, don't want any of this, but don't know what to do about it and don't think that much about it. So when people, I like to think that people are not poor. People are made poor. There's a verb missing. So when we rethink, when we put the verb back in, who is causing what's happening to happen and what is the history of that, we come up with very different conclusions about what to do. So are we going to fight against one pesticide at a time? So we get rid of Roundup, just like we got rid of others before. We got rid of arsenic. We thought, as it turns out, there's still arsenic in the Roundup. So we thought, it's just coming out now, but we thought we got rid of arsenic, which used to be used as a pesticide back in the early 1900s. And then we got rid of DDT after Rachel Carson and thousands of people inaugurated a fight against the organochlorines. Then it went to organophosphates. So and now it's Roundup, and we get rid of Roundup, and they come back with dicamba, which is now available in many states, and many states are now fighting against dicamba.
So what do we do?
How do we fight the system of this?
I want to throw in one more thing I learned from your book, that there are tens of thousands of potentially toxic chemicals in our products, in our food, in all the products that we use, and only 5 of them have been banned. And it takes.
I think it was 7 were banned. There were 80,000 that were introduced in the past few years, and only 7 were tested and banned by the FDA.
And it takes 25 years.
In less, I think it was 10 years. But I believe. I'm not sure about that.
But I think in the book it says it takes 25 years to ban a substance.
Well, the FDA and the U.S. government, they don't have the precautionary principle, which would mean that before something is put out there and used in nature or on the market, you have to prove it's safe first to people, to nature. Instead, we have it backwards. And so that's why there are tens of thousands of chemicals that are put out there. And then if people start dying from it or get sick from it, then maybe they will check it out and see if it deserves to be banned, and even there, it's hardly any. And then when some things are banned here, right? When some chemicals are banned here, so they're applied to food elsewhere in the world. They're sold elsewhere. They're not removed from the Earth's surface. So there are corporations in other countries that then manufacture them. Those countries use them, and we import the food that is using the banned chemical from that was banned in the United States, but we eat it anyway. So if the food is not organic, don't eat it. It's really dangerous. It's hard to do, and it's expensive. It shouldn't be expensive, but it's hard. But that's one of the ways of approaching it. We also have Miami banning the use of glyphosate and use of Roundup just a few weeks ago. This is a major city that has said, the hell with this. Why don't they do it in New York? Why don't they do this in other places? In New York City, we have them using glyphosate, not even for health, for agricultural reasons, just for cosmetic, to take out weeds in New York City parks and from in between the cement and the sidewalks. And they're just spraying it. And we've been fighting this campaign. We've met with them 1,000,000 times. They don't, well, this is a podcast. I guess I could curse. I don't like
No. This is terrestrial. You can't curse.
Okay, I won't curse. I won't say what I really feel. So they need to, even the de Blasio mayor of New York City, you know, he followed in Mayor Giuliani, who inaugurated the spraying of malathion and poisoned the entire city to kill a few mosquitoes against what they said was against the West Nile virus carrying mosquitoes, as if that was true, and as if this is the way of dealing with that, if it is true. Then it went to Bloomberg, supposedly an environmental activist who wanted more trees in the city. But Bloomberg continued the spraying program, continued all the poisoning under him, eliminated recycling, eliminated some of the programs that we fought for, even under Giuliani that were there. And now we have de Blasio, the progressive mayor, who's continuing to work with developers and in bed with the developers, and who's continuing to spray and poison us. For what? To kill a few weeds.
So what is the big picture strategy? How do we get on top of this? What you say in the book is going after one chemical doesn't work, because as soon as you do that, they come up with a variant or another one. What is the bigger picture approach that's going to help save our planet and help save the hundreds of thousands or millions of people who are getting cancer and disease and suffering because of these chemicals?
Well, I think we have to eliminate private ownership and control of these huge aspects of our lives and take them back. And if they were put under public decision-making, informed consent, I mean, we mobilized our community in Bensonhurst, Brooklyn, where I live. We mobilized it to shut down the municipal incinerator that was poisoning the community to high levels of cancer in our community, lung problems, all sorts. And we mobilized all these actually conservative people in other areas, politically conservative, as well as progressive, both. I think there's a false distinction, actually. And we mobilized them against the incinerator because everybody saw a common interest in not getting cancer from it and not having their children destroyed by it. And so that's part of the answer, is to mobilize against. I could go into more about the
I have some questions about that, but we need to do a quick show ID. So the way I do a show ID is I've already identified the show for the video audience, but I'm going to pause for 10 seconds so I can throw in a bumper for the radio show.
Okay.
And my guest for this show is Mitchel Cohen. He coordinates the No Spray Coalition in New York City, and he is the author of the book, The Fight Against Monsanto's Roundup, The Politics of Pesticides. And he's on with Robin Falk-Esser, who has a PhD in physiology and biophysics and has published papers in Science and Nature, the Journal of Physiology, and the Journal of General Physiology, and the Biophysical Journal. And we're talking about what's the solution when going one shot at a time after pesticides or herbicides doesn't work. And Mitch answered that the answer is to take it out of the private hands. But then you went and said that you had this, what was it? What do you call it? We were burning up an incinerator that was causing all kinds of pollution. So that was a publicly owned thing. So maybe it's not just taking it public and bringing it back to the commons. It's got to be a change in the way of thinking, isn't it, Mitch? It's
yeah,
not,
absolutely.
So what's
the
the
two go
change
together, though. People change their thinking when we're active in fighting for what we need and what we feel has been taken from us and need to take it back. We need to take our health back. We need to take our entire society back in many ways. So what we did with the incinerator, I thought it was really instructive because the city was running this incinerator without people actually knowing what was going on, without even a permit for many, many years. And then when the produce the environmental impact statements after a big fight demanding to see them, then it turned out that the environmental impact statements had nothing to do and didn't say anything about where the garbage is going to be dumped, about what garbage is being produced, who's producing the garbage. So that became an important issue for us.
The other thing is that when the government is controlling something, it's not really just the government, because the government is hand in hand with the corporate and with corporations and industry. And one of the really positive things that that's going on right now is the movement for the Green New Deal, the emphasis on the environment, people like Greta Thunberg motivating children around the world to stand up against climate change. And the problem of pesticides should be integrated with that policy along with the Green New Deal, because unless we get rid of fossil fuel economy, fossil fuel-based economy, we won't be getting rid of pesticides. They're hand in hand together.
How?
And how?
Yeah.
Because agribusiness is hand in hand with the chemical companies and the oil companies. Actually, many of the pesticides were petroleum byproducts. Not necessarily all of them, but many of them were. And the corporate control is integrated together. So the fossil fuel companies and are connected with big pharmaceutical houses, and the pharmaceutical houses are connected with the pesticide companies.
And I love
fact,
the way you say
the same.
In the book, it talks about how the pesticide and herbicide products produce cancer, that the same companies that are producing the pesticides and herbicides then produce the drugs to treat the cancer. So they got a whole cycle going there.
Yep, it is a whole cycle. And one thing we need to think of is the Green New Deal, which was started by the Green Party, actually, and nobody wants to give credit for when it got taken over, is that it's now becoming more of a soundbite, and it doesn't talk about a lot of things that we need. So we have to ensure. So part of the fight is to ensure that the Green New Deal includes opposition to genetic engineering, includes opposition to pesticides and Roundup. It doesn't right now, as it's been put in Congress by the Democrats, even the progressive Democrats, who I think some of them are doing okay. So we need to be on their case, and we need to, there is a massive movement internationally against genetic engineering, and that's part of what we need to, part of the fight back that we need to emphasize and push. And it also requires, I think, dismantling the corporations, the corporate structure. And I think it's really important that we put that, not in, by public control, I don't mean bureaucrats in some government somewhere like de Blasio or Bloomberg. I mean, people organize in our communities, in our workplaces, in our schools, where we talk about all this and we have control over all this. I know in Cuba, they had a huge discussion that went on for 3 years nationwide in Cuba about genetic engineering. Should they produce genetically engineered crops or not? This just ended 2 years ago, and they decided not to pursue genetic engineering, even though it would help produce food that they think they would need. People, not that they think they would need, but people like Jimmy Carter say they would need. Jimmy Carter is a big proponent of genetic engineering. Clinton and Gore were big proponents of genetic engineering, and George Bush was as well. It's not a Republican or Democrat thing. It's both. Both parties represent this arm of a way of thinking and a way of acting in the world that oppresses us.
And I think the way to characterize it is corporatist and war against nature. It's a refusal to accept the fact that we have to coexist with nature, and that the old mentality, the top-down mentality of dominating nature, has to end. because it's not sustainable. It's not going to last. We're not going to be able to dominate nature. Nature will maybe collapse, but we're going to collapse with nature. And then, so
That's
the
right.
new solution is go to Mars, leave the Earth, despoil it, destroy it, and leave.
Absolutely. That's the absurd. We could look at one of the good books on this stuff is Joel Koval's book, The War Against Nature, which is excellent. And he looks at what a different socialist world and real socialism would look like in terms of nature and human beings, what it means to be reappropriating the commons. Sylvia Federici has written extensively about this.
I just had her on the show a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, really? I missed it.
Yeah.
What did you say?
Well, that we need to take back the commons, that we've got to feminize the commons, that we've got to re-own it. But, I worry too. When you talk about socialism, the people on the right refer to the socialism of the Soviet Union. And I was there shortly after Glasnost, and it was devastating. I mean, it was so trashed, that country, so much. It was really, there were beautiful. I went to Siberia in the summer, and they had a beautiful taiga, these fields a mile long that were gorgeous. But in many parts of the cities, they were just filthy and disgusting. And I would really be scared of handing over the power to over nature to bureaucracies, and I struggle with that, because part of my philosophy about bottom up is small is better, and big government scares me. And when you start talking about handing this over to these guys who are the mayors of New York and what have you, they're not doing a good job when they get the opportunity. So I think we really need to think about how we need to localize it. I think localization is really important. But so I'm
Well, I agree with you, Rob. I agree that, and a lot of us who came out of different social movements and environmental movements, like myself, never saw socialism as being exemplified in the Soviet Union. We saw the Soviet Union as being state capitalist, and that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about, as you put it, small group control over our lives, making decisions about our own lives. So workers in an area deciding on, a good example with the green bans in Australia way back when, where anytime they wanted to put in a project, it went through the community, it went through the workers, they all talked about it, whether they wanted it or not, how to do it in a green way if they wanted it, and not to destroy everything around them. And this was a major movement that the U.S. government then destroyed by working with the Australian government at the time in order to bust up those unions that were pushing the green bans on this kind of what they call development, which is not development, it's destruction of everything around us. So yeah, so I agree. That's not the socialism I'm talking about. On the other hand, one of the main proponents of environment unexpectedly in many for the last 5 years of his life was Fidel Castro. And that was really, really interesting. He opposed genetic engineering. He opposed the use of production of corn for fuel, taking away food for that land that should be used for food. He went into all of that, and people don't realize what he was saying and how people in Cuba took part in this discussion around all these issues. So whether you like the government or not, there was this huge discussion that was happening that doesn't exist here in a way that gives us any power. There is discussion of it. There is a lot of people fighting around this stuff, but we don't have power to implement it because of precisely what you say.
Well, one thing more, but that's really, you got me thinking. I think you're right that capitalism is a part of the problem that has led to the big agri-industrialization of the food system and the relationship between the harvesting and the growing of crops and food and nature. And so maybe the answer is that capitalism is toxic to that. I mean, I'm just thinking about this, but if you're talking socialism as the solution, then that means that capitalism is the problem. Or could there be a capitalism that is a benign capitalism that would enable a food system that was sustainable and healthy?
My opinion, I agree that there can be no capitalism that would be sustainable and healthy because it's based on private profit of corporations and of exploitation of other people and nature. So I don't believe that that kind of system, whether socialism as we come to know it is the answer. No, as we come to know it, no, it's not the answer. But that's not socialism. People put the word social back in socialism. You can take out the ism. Abby Hoffman once said, we need to make every ism a wasm. And
I love that.
And just let's do social, let's do sharing, let's do the commoning. And all of that is what we're talking about here. I know that Robin Esser is itching to get in a few words here.
I'm going to do a show ID. Let me do a brief show ID. Again, we're going to pause for 10 seconds, and then I'll do a reintroduction of you in the book. So quiet for 10 seconds. Now you got to be quiet. You got to be quiet on your end too. And my guests for this show are Mitchel Cohen, who's the author of the book, The Fight Against Monsanto's Roundup, The Politics of Pesticides, and Robin Falk Esser, who has a PhD in physiology and biophysics and has published papers in Science and Nature, the Journal of Physiology, and more. And now we're going to talk about the actual effects of Monsanto on people, on animals, on cells. And the first thing that I think is really important that you talk about in your portion of the book, Robin, is that it's Monsanto's Roundup is not just glyphosate. And when they give reports on how it affects people, they tend to just talk about glyphosate. But Roundup is made with what are called adjuvants, which are different compounds that are added to it to make it work more effectively with plants. And those have some really nasty toxic chemicals in them as well. So just to set off the conversation. Now, go Robin.
Okay, so exactly correct what you just said, that Roundup, the product, is a mixture of glyphosate, the active ingredient, which is toxic on its own, and also adjuvants or formulants, additives that are purposely added by Monsanto to increase the efficiency of glyphosate. And in addition, there are contaminants present like arsenic. So Roundup's toxicity is not only due to glyphosate, but also due to, for example, POEAs, polyoxyethyleneamines, which are purposely added in order to increase the uptake of glyphosate into the target organism. And it's an interesting, and then arsenic was discovered to be present in December 2017. Discovered. It's hard to believe that Monsanto wasn't aware that it was a contaminant from in-house chemical studies that they must have done. But it was has been shown to be present in all mixes of glyphosate pretty much worldwide at very significant levels. And of course, arsenic is a serious poison. In addition, glyphosate itself is a neurotoxin. There's been a number of studies, both in the field results and in labs, that show that glyphosate on its own is a neurotoxin. It is a cholinesterase inhibitor. That means that it stops the destruction of acetylcholine, a neurotransmitter, which is only supposed to be around for milliseconds. So if this glyphosate is present, the acetylcholine collects, and that is what causes it to be a neurotoxin. And in addition, your point was that you mentioned that the studies that have been done by the industry, accepted by oversight agencies such as the EPA and the FDA, all these studies were done only on glyphosate. So they never included the other additives. And however, even if they had honestly reported the effect of glyphosate, there's no doubt that they would not have been able to report that it was safe. Because if you look at studies that have been done with only glyphosate, you do see neurotoxicity.
Well, one question. You talk about
yes.
The idea that glyphosate acts as a cholinesterase inhibitor that stops destruction of acetylcholine. What is the function of acetylcholine, and what happens when you stop it from being destroyed?
Right. Okay. So acetylcholine is a very common neurotransmitter in the nervous system, and if you stop it being destroyed, you cause effects on the nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, and it's a myriad of different effects depending on the situation. It's also an endocrine disruptor, so it has effects on hormone. Okay, reproduction, and it also has been shown to be a carcinogen in the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and the IARC, the International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is an arm of the World Health Organization, in 2015 found it to be a probable carcinogen. So I can't be any more specific on the effects on the nervous system other than a neurotoxin. That means that it could cause tremors, it could cause a myriad of problems with the nervous system.
So one more thing, because I understand there's another aspect that is not referred to, and that's that Roundup also affects gut bacteria.
Correct. Yes, it would definitely affect the gut bacteria, and there's more and more studies being shown how important the bacteria in your GI tract is to your health, and how it affects fat metabolism in the liver, and can have a big effect on many different systems. Yes.
And now I know there's a chapter that gets into the difference in the way the science was approached by IARC, the cancer organization tied to the UN, and others, and how the FDA handled it. Can you get into that? I know you didn't write that chapter, but can you get into that a little bit about why is the FDA not looking at what the UN came up with as something significant and basically saying?
Well, I did actually. Yeah, that is actually in my chapter,
oh, okay.
And the problem is that the FDA is staffed by people who work for industry, lobbyists for industry, and there's a collusion between the industry and the oversight agencies that is rampant in the U.S. government and in other governments. And even when the EPA and the FDA were at their strongest in the 1970s and 1980s, this was a significant problem called the revolving door, where people would leave industry, go into the FDA or EPA, presumably with the idea that these people were most knowledgeable about the product and therefore should be the ones to oversee it and okay the studies. So the studies are not only were only about glyphosate, but they also were, there's a lot of pressure on industry scientists to report what the industry wants them to. So I think that addresses the point that you were making, is that these studies can't really be trusted.
Now, I've gone to, between the two of you.
In fact, Rob, that some of Monsanto's early own scientists, we talked about some of that in the book, came out and said that Monsanto cannot say what they're saying, that they're safe. And Monsanto just refused to put that out publicly and buried their own scientists' statements about it. And this has only been coming out during the trials that people have been suing Monsanto over. And part of the anger, one of the reasons the juries have awarded such pretty high monetary damages, is they said actually to teach Monsanto a lesson. That they've had this history of lying, this history of hiding things in order to make money and in order to gain control. And this is anathema to most people who are on juries, as well as most of the rest of us. We don't want that. We want, obviously, we want things that are produced and ourselves producing it in healthy ways. We don't want to be subjected to poison chemicals. We don't want to be subjected to poison air. We don't want, and this can be, a lot of this can be achieved. Not all of it, but a lot of it can be achieved by changing the way things are produced and who's producing it and what decisions go into it. There's arguments to be made that all industrialization, you were pointing to this actually at the beginning of the show, that all industrialization may have caused, unless it's small scale, may cause irreparable damage, and that there's nothing that can be done about that, except to do it in a different way. So if we train ourselves differently, to think differently, then we can organize our own societies in a different way than they're organized today, and maybe do away with the assembly line mentality, do away with the assembly line production of things that are destroying the environment, and find new ways of meeting our own needs and producing the things that we need. That's a very general picture that I
just wanted to say one thing about the big picture question that you posed earlier.
Yeah,
and
sure.
that is that, right now, organic food is only 1% of the market, and it may seem like a silly little thing for people to do, but if we can move organic food to being 15% of the market, we can have a real leverage against the industry. So that's something that every individual can do, even if organic food is a few cents more. Whenever they can push the supermarkets to carry organic produce, organic grains, and make the companies aware of that.
I got to tell you, I stopped into a supermarket near me that I'd never been to before. And the first question I asked them was, do you have organic produce? Do you have organic food? And they said no. And you know what I did? I walked out. I walked through, right. And it was a aisle after aisle of processed brand name garbage. And I walked out, and I've said it many times before, as have my guests. The middle aisles of the supermarkets, they're the processed food aisles. You're not going to find the healthy stuff there. You got to stay away from them. And I think I don't eat everything organic. I should, but I don't. But one thing that I always eat organic is bread. Now you can't avoid it when you're eating out at a restaurant. But at least at home, you can get organic bread. And what is that? It costs a couple pennies more, maybe per slice of bread. That's worth it.
Right, and that's just the beginning. That's a stepping off point. But if individuals are really the bottom-up idea that you've been discussing is really being seen in activism worldwide today. For example, the extinction resistance movement, where people around the world are just gluing themselves to banks and sidewalks in front of banks, and companies that are profiting off the pollution of the world and global warming. So people can get involved in local actions. There are so many groups today that are doing such wonderful direct action work. And even if they don't feel themselves that they want to glue themselves, they can offer support so to others who are doing that. So it's just so much out there. And another idea is for teachers to get involved in doing experiments. There are many teachers around the country who are part of organizations that are working for the environment. And these teachers could work with their students on lab experiments with glyphosate done in a safe way so that the students were protected, either in the lab or in the field, and pool their data and have units that are politicizing, radicalizing themselves and the students. And you see a lot of activism among the teachers today.
I love
and
that.
It just brings to mind.
That should be required. Education should include a requirement to educate students on their relationship to environment and food and industrial production of products. You know, but there are two things I want to cover, and we don't have that much time left. One is I went to Wikipedia and I looked up Roundup and Monsanto, and reading Wikipedia, you would think that Roundup was safer than mother's milk. What's the story there? Well,
Basically, it's being influenced by the industry's perspective. You know, the industry is literally lying. They're lying about the results, and you know, science can be manipulated to produce the results that the industry wants, and they're very powerful. The profit motive and the control, and so if you read that Roundup is safe, you just look at the studies that have been done in the field on the effects on invertebrates, amphibians, not to mention.
And that's the other thing I wanted you to get into. Please, in your chapter, you talk about the effect on butterflies and on amphibians and other animals and honeybees. Talk a little bit about how Roundup and glyphosate is affecting the rest of the natural world, as well as just what it's doing to humans.
Okay, well, specifically monarch butterflies, Roundup has been killing off the food that the larvae uses. The immature form of the monarch butterfly is a specialist. It lives off only milkweed, and Roundup is killing the milkweed. Specifically, it's a weed, and Roundup's made to do that, and it's killing the milkweed all along the migratory route of the monarch butterfly. And it takes the monarch butterfly 3 generations to make the trip, 1,000-mile trip that it goes through. So it's having a direct impact on the monarch butterflies, as is global, as is climate change, and not to mention Trump's proposed wall on the southern border is actually cutting through an international sanctuary for monarch butterflies and physically destroying it at this very time. So anyway, getting back to Roundup and butterflies, yes, so it's having the effect there. The bees, the honeybees, are also affected by Roundup, but also neonicotinoids is another pesticide that has a direct effect on honeybees, as does perchlorophyll, which is another pesticide that's used. So, you know.
So when we were traveling through Baltimore on a trip up and down the East Coast, looking at the book, and there were a number of people in Baltimore who were organizing against chlorpyrifos, and they were coming before trying to get it banned. And all over the country, there are these little groups that are taking up the effort to get pesticides of all sorts banned in their area.
I just want to say again about glyphosate's effect seen in ecosystems directly, that glyphosate is very similar chemically in structure to glycine, an amino acid. Amino acids are the building blocks of protein, and glycine is a very common amino acid present in all proteins, in all living things. you know, when you say all, you know, almost all proteins in all living things. And the difference between glycine and glyphosate is simply that glyphosate has an extra phosphate group, a phosphate group added to it.
What's the significance of that? What's the significance of glyphosate being similar to the amino acid glycine?
Well, it could substitute in a myriad of metabolic pathways for glycine. And that work is discussed in detail in the book of Politics of Pesticides that we've been discussing by a scientist, Stephanie Seneff, who's at MIT.
And what are some of the effects? Go ahead, tell us about it.
So if glyphosate substitutes for glycine, you would end up having proteins unable to do their job in many, many situations. And so that would account for its neurotoxicity. We don't know how it exerts its effects in the field. We don't know why it causes these problems, reproductive problems and neurotoxic problems and cancer type tumors being produced, but these are possible ways that it could do it.
Okay, now wait, we've only got a couple minutes left, and I just saw something I wanted to pick up from you. You say that the unexpected environmental effect of planting tropical milkweed is one simple example of chaos theory in action. As in is the effect of the widespread use of pesticides? Are you talking about emergent properties there?
I don't think so. What I was talking about there, well, I can see emergent properties. That's like synergism. You combine things together, you never know what's going to happen. Yeah. In a way, I'm talking about that. But I'm also saying what happened is these very dedicated environmentalists went to the store and tried to plant milkweed to replace the milkweed that was killed off by Roundup. But the only milkweed that was available at that time was tropical milkweed. And so the nymph form of the butterfly didn't ever leave. It didn't migrate. It stayed where it was on the plant because the tropical milkweed
that's a cue for them.
Didn't die off. Didn't die off. So it was an unexpected effect. And that doesn't mean that people shouldn't take action into their own hands. They should. And this was a great thing that the people had done. And the problem has been corrected because now they're planting the correct milkweed that is not going to cause other effects.
This is a hard problem. We got a minute left. So, Mitch, you want to wrap up and finish anything?
Sure. I have a lot to finish. Well, actually, there's something that Robin Esser was telling me in our tour that I had never heard before, and I was astounded by. And in the labs that she worked in, well, you could ask her about how scientists that she saw with her own eyes deep-sixed information that ran counter to the hypothesis that they were trying to explore and trying to prove. And this was astounding to me because you don't think of this as run-of-the-mill and top labs. So it's not only the giant corporations. So I thought maybe, Robin, you might want to address that.
Well, I don't know how much time we have.
Yeah,
but,
we're really down.
Okay, so I did work in labs in Cambridge, Oxford. I was working in the forefront of science in cardiac electrophysiology. And I did find that it was not uncommon for people to find excuses to throw out data that was not in keeping with their hypothesis or theory, that it was a common thing to do. And these are among basic scientists of renown, very well-respected people and their labs. So you can imagine—
universities or working at corporations?
Working totally not at corporations. It's funded by the NIH, certainly indirect. If by corporations, it would be indirect, pharmaceutical houses indirectly. And so these were very well-respected groups, and it was, again, not uncommon to throw out data that was not in keeping with the theory that they were trying to show. And there's no question about that. And it was disheartening. And you can imagine that among the industry scientists, this problem would be even more rampant, because the pressure on them to produce what the industry wanted to see would be overwhelming.
It's discouraging. We've got to wrap. We do have to wrap now, though. This is a very hard problem. And so I really want to thank my guests for this show. Mitch Cohen is the author of the book, The Fight Against Monsanto's Roundup, The Politics of Pesticides, and Robin Falk-Esser, who is a PhD in physiology and biophysics, who wrote a chapter in the book on the effects of Monsanto and Roundup on people and animals and cells. Thanks so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Rob. This is great. And thanks. Tell your audience, get active, meet with other people, join together, and let's pull back what's stolen from us and rechange the world.
All right.
Thank you.